G'day guys, and welcome back to the Life Outside podcast, where we share stories from outside to hopefully inspire you to get outside as well. My name is Cam Bostock, and I have just come off hiking the Tour du Mont Blanc in Europe, one of my favorite hikes to date, one of the most iconic trails on planet Earth. And of course, I'm going to be recapping the adventure on an episode of Trail Talk here on the Life Outside podcast. So if you're interested in the TMB at all, strap in and we'll spend the next 30 or 40 minutes talking about the trail. I'm going to give a bit of a recap of what the trail is, some stats, where it is, some logistics and all that kind of stuff. And then I'll run through my experience on the trail as well. Did it over 6 days, so I'll go through each day in a little bit of detail and share some stories. And then towards the end of the episode, I'm going to answer some questions from you guys, the listeners, which you asked over on Instagram. So it should be a fun episode. Really looking forward to it. If you've listened to the Life Outside podcast for a while, you've probably heard me talk about OptiVenture. It's a company I co-founded with a simple mission: to provide comprehensive and convenient supplementation solutions for hikers and outdoor adventurers. We sold out of our version 1 all-in-one supplement within 24 hours of launch, and we're excited to finally announce that we're launching version 2, which we're calling OptiVenture Core, this August. It's been a lengthy process, but we weren't going to cut any corners, and we're so proud of what we've created. A day-night formulation with the highest quality ingredients to optimize energy, recovery, immunity, inflammation, and support your gut both on and off the trail. For more information and to stay up to date, check our website, optiventure.co, and make sure to sign up to our email newsletter. Thanks for the support, and let's get into today's episode. If you haven't heard of the TMB before, it is one of the world's most iconic multi-day hikes. It loops around Mont Blanc in the European Alps, crosses through 3 countries, France, Italy, and Switzerland, and the classic route is about 170 kilometers long, so just over 100 miles, with 10,000 meters of elevation gain and another 10,000 meters of elevation loss. So lots of up and down. As I said, I've just come off the trail. I hiked the entire route with my good mates Daniel McKinnon and Emma Lawson, which if you guys have listened to the podcast at all or followed me for very long, you'll know I've hiked with these two quite a bit. We hiked the Pacific Crest Trail last year. More recently, we hiked the Camino de Santiago across Spain, and just continuing our European adventures with the Tour du Mont Blanc. And it was really fun hiking with those guys. As always, we ended up actually walking about 200 kilometers with about 12,000 meters of up and 12,000 meters of down, so quite a bit more than the classic route. That's because we tackled pretty much every alternate that we could on trail. So there's high route alternates, fairly regularly around the loop, where you can choose to take a typically more technical, more difficult alternate route that may have better views, may not. We took all the high route alternates, so I actually don't know what the classic route in those sections looked like, but I will say it was well worth taking those alternates, even though they were harder from what we hear. They were just a whole lot of fun. And of course, we took a few little side trips as well. So we ended up walking about 30 kilometers extra and a couple thousand meters extra elevation gain. So it was a pretty massive week in the mountains, insane scenery. Big climbs, big descents, pretty sore legs by the end of it. Dan, Emma, and I pushed pretty hard to complete the trail in less than a week. We walked it over 6 days, which is definitely not typical. I think people probably spend 10 to 12 days usually out on the TMB, but we had a fairly limited space, like a fairly limited amount of time, to walk the trail. So we pushed pretty hard to get it all done in less than a week. And we just love pushing ourselves anyway, so we had a lot of fun doing it despite being pretty sore at the end. So bit of information about the TMB. As I mentioned, it's set in the spectacular European Alps. First time visiting for me, and man, it was just magical out there. And literally just circles the highest mountain in Western Europe, Mont Blanc, which is just under 5,000 meters tall. I think Tour in French means loop or lap. So Tour du Mont Blanc translates to loop of the White Mountain. That's right. So you're basically just doing a nice big circle around the biggest mountain in Western Europe, and you see it, from all angles, and it's a very beautiful mountain. So very cool. And yeah, the route passes through 3 countries. So we started and ended in France, in Les Sujets, which is near Chamonix, and passed through Italy and Switzerland along the way. Yeah, it's pretty cool. You're in a country almost every day, a new country almost every day, and there's real noticeable changes in the culture, in the food, and obviously the language, even the currency, and it makes it a very interesting hike from that perspective. On top of just incredible views the entire way, you're just seeing snow-capped peaks everywhere, glaciers, waterfalls, meadows. Walking through really beautiful villages and towns as well, and yeah, just a really awesome hike. There's a reason so many people do it, and it's so iconic. It's because it's bloody amazing. You might have also heard of the trail from the famous ultra race that follows the route more or less, the Ultra Trail du Mont Blanc, which is something that I've followed along with each year for quite a while now. And actually, as I record this a couple weeks after hiking the trail, I think the UTMB race is just around the corner. So looking forward to following along with it again this year, especially now that I've walked the route. And I remember being on the trail and thinking, how does anybody run this trail? It is, it's just very, very hard with the amount of elevation change, and running it as fast as those guys do in the race is pretty wild. As far as accommodation along the trail, you can do it a couple of different ways. Most people, I think, will stay in the refuges. So Europe's known for having refuges where you can spend the night throughout the Alps and mountain ranges. And typically you get a meal like breakfast and dinner while staying at those refuges. They are pretty expensive from what I've heard. So we didn't actually choose to spend any nights in refuges. We camped the whole way, which is another thing you can do. Wild camping is limited in the Alps, and it's, the regulations are different in each country that you pass through as well. So there's a bit to think about if you decide to camp the whole way. There are, sanctioned campsites in some of the towns as well, which makes things a bit easier. But that was something that we sort of dealt with, and I'll go through as I recap each day. There's also hotels and Airbnbs and hostels in some of the towns that you pass through on the TMB. So you can kind of mix and match those options, the refuges, the hotels, and the camping, or just choose to do it one singular, accommodation style, depending on, if you want to carry a camping setup, which makes your pack a lot heavier, obviously. Depends how much money you want to spend, how slow you want to go, whether you want to, meet people at the refuges, which might be something that you're interested in. There's definitely a few options. We just wanted to save money, and honestly, I just much prefer camping compared to staying in a building when I'm doing my hikes. And so it was the obvious choice for us to spend each night in a tent, and also gives us a lot of flexibility. So we, because we wild camped most nights, we didn't really have a set spot that we had to get to. We could walk further or shorter, and I definitely prefer hiking that way. We also carried all our own food, cooked all our own meals on trail. So, we didn't eat at refuges. I think we ate out a couple times in towns, but for the most part, we just stocked up at supermarkets in towns that we passed through, stopped at the occasional bakery to get a baguette and a croissant, and that's how we sort of, ingested calories on the TMB. A very cheap way to do it, and a very flexible way to do it as well. And so we didn't really spend too much money walking the TMB compared to what you definitely could if you decided to stay in accommodation and eat out every night. Someone did ask a question about like a rough cost breakdown of the trek, which I'll answer when we get to the Q&A at the end of the video. As far as when to hike it, typically the European Alps hiking is done in summer because the snow is melted, especially at the lower altitudes of routes like the TMB. So we pretty much hiked in peak summer right in the midst of it, which meant we had long days, plenty of sunlight each day, which is a lot of fun on trail, because if you like hiking long days like me, having a lot of sun and a lot of light each day is perfect. And we didn't have too much bad weather. For the most part, it was just reasonable temperatures. We did have some summer storms come through, so a bit of rain. And some days were pretty hot, but for the most part, it was really pleasant. And we didn't really walk on any snow. I think there was one high pass that had snow underfoot, but for the most part, it was just, beautiful trail. Still plenty of water around because at the higher altitudes there's snow melting, and so you've got streams and stuff and rivers flowing, which is really nice. And yes, definitely recommend hiking the trail in summer. In winter, obviously, it's going to be a very different experience, and you're going to need a lot different gear. But because of how iconic the trail is, and because everyone wants to hike in summer, it's very busy during this time of year also. So that's something to keep in mind. I typically don't love hiking trails that are this busy, but the TMB is just one of those trails that I had to hike one day, and I was in the European Alps, so made it happen. And when it was busy, I just kind of, you know, duck dived and dodged around people and tried to get out into my own space. So that's some of the, I guess, basic information about the trail. I'll run through, the daily recaps. So I spent 6 days on trail, as mentioned. Day one started in Les Houches in France. Also, just a bit of a forewarning, I'm going to pronounce a lot of these town names and pass names and mountain names incorrectly because I am shocking at European pronunciation, as has been pointed out many times on my Instagram videos of this hike. I'm trying my best. I'm slowly learning how to pronounce things better, but I'm going to butcher a lot of it. So I'm so sorry if you're European or French or Italian and I say your words wrong. Please forgive me. Yes, we started in Les Houches in France, which is just the next town over from Chamonix in the beautiful, Chamonix Valley there. And we had a massive climb out of town to start the trek. That'll be a running theme throughout each day. It's just big climbs and big descents, followed by big climbs and big descents. Not a whole lot of flat walking, but that's just the nature of walking in a big mountain range like this. But we did have a very a very big climb to start, starting in town. But instantly, it was just so stunning, and I was hooked on the TMB from the first couple hours. Just insane views. Once we got up to about 2,000 meters, we had our first views of Mont Blanc and the high mountains of the Alps, and man, it was it was really special. And we decided to take our first alternate route on day one up to Col de Tricot, which I think is how you pronounce that. But the Col de Tricot high route was really cool. Probably the busiest part of the whole trail actually was this section. A lot of day hikers and also a lot of TMB hikers, but really stunning. We took a little side trip at the pass up Mount Vorosay, which was about 2,300 meters tall, which was really cool. We tried to take as many side trips that were easily accessible off the trail as possible just to really make the most of the trip. And Mount Vorosay was stunning. We then descended into a town called Les Contamines or Contamines, which was nice. So we resupplied on some food and then continued on and ended up wild camping near a refuge just out of that town. So we walked about 35 kilometers on day one, 2,400 meters of elevation gain, just massive day. Every day ended up being, I think, over 2,000 meters of elevation gain. There's just so many climbs, but it was good training for the legs and ended up handling it pretty well. But we set up camp at this camping area near a refuge, and there were so many people there. It was actually kind of ridiculous. We finished really late on day one, so the campsite was just swarming. There's probably maybe 40 tents there, and there was probably space for like 20. So everyone was just squeezed in. I ended up having to camp on a slanted piece of grass and was slipping all over the place during the night. But it was stunning, and we met some cool folk at the campsite there that we chatted with a bit before bed. Yeah, it was a very cool day one. Before I forget, I'll try and go over some of the wild camping regulations now as well, because I know that's a question that a lot of people asked me. And each country that you go through has sort of different wild camping regulations. Switzerland, as far as I'm aware, you cannot wild camp at all. So that's something to keep in mind. We had to plan around not being able to camp wherever we wanted in Switzerland. In France, it's a little bit more relaxed, and we spent the most nights of this trail in France, which was handy. You just cannot set up camp before 7 p.m. and you have to leave camp before 9 a.m. in the morning. So that's the main restriction in France. And then there are just some areas in the French part of the TMB that you can't camp at all, which we found were signed. But other than that, it was pretty much free game. between the hours of 7 p.m. and 9 a.m. So that was something to keep in mind. And when we set up camp at the end of day one, we set up after 7 and we left before 9 the next morning. And that's completely allowed as far as I'm aware. And then in Italy, you just had to set up camp above 2,000 meters above sea level. So that was, and I believe there was like a curfew, maybe it was between 7 p.m. and 9 a.m. in Italy as well. It was all a little bit confusing, but we made sure to do our research beforehand and mainly just followed the guidelines and the other hikers that we saw along the route to make sure we weren't breaking any wild camping rules, because it's a little bit confusing as a foreigner trying to work out exactly where and where you can't camp. I'm pretty sure we didn't do anything wrong. So take that with a grain of salt. Do your own research before getting onto the TMB and make sure you're trying to follow the regulations as well as you can. But night one we set up at this group campsite where there was a lot of other people, so I think that was all good. And then day 2 we began with another big climb, of course, and we actually started another alternate route pretty early on day 2 up Col des Fours. Col is pass, so whenever I say a name starting with Col, it's a high pass. And that was where we saw some snow up on that high pass, which was kind of cool. We also saw some chamois up there, which is like this goat deer type of animal. We didn't see too much wildlife, but that was really cool on day 2 to see. There was like a herd of like 8 of them up there. Super cool. And we also took another side route up Tête Nord des Fours from that high pass, which was almost 3,000 meters above sea level. I think 2,750, give or take. And that was a really cool little mount to climb. And it's always nice doing like a little out and back peak on these longer routes, because you can drop your pack, go up for a climb, come back and continue on with your pack. And I just remember the views from the top of Tête Nord des Fours being incredible, like just Mont Blanc staring right down your throat. And it was really special. And day 2 we also crossed into Italy towards the end of the day via the Col de la Seine. And that was our second country, and actually my first time ever in Italy, which was kind of cool to just be walking across the border and then, spending a bit of time there on the TMB. And day 2 was just, incredibly beautiful as well. Ended up walking 30 kilometers or just under with another 2,000 meters of elevation gain. So a little bit less than day 1, and it was a little bit easier, but still a pretty big day. And we camped near this river just above 2,000 meters above sea level. This was like the one time we camped where we actually weren't 100% sure if we were within the regulations. As far as I'm aware, based on my understanding of the rules, we were fine, but there just wasn't many other people camping like near where we were, so we were a bit iffy. But look, we're very low key when we camp anyway, and obviously leave no trace and all that good stuff. So I think we were all good there, regardless, didn't cause any issues. Day 3, we had a pretty massive climb to start the day, as always. And that was followed by a massive descent into the Italian town of Courmayeur, which is, from what I was told talking to a local, Courmayeur is like the equivalent of Chamonix in France. It's just like this famous ski and hiking town, and it was really beautiful. It was funny, we just before starting the descent down into Courmayeur, we were like offered the option to take the chairlift down into town, which actually happened a few times on the TMB, because there's like obviously ski fields everywhere, not operating in the summer months, but the ski fields are not operating, sorry, but the chairlifts and the gondolas and stuff were for mountain bikers and hikers and just sightseers. So we were like offered the option to take the gondola down into Courmayeur, which would have saved us like 1,500 meters of descending or something like that. And we were kind of tempted, but we were pretty elitist and didn't want to skip any trails, so we made the big descent down. And descending is always like one of those things where you think it's going to be easier than going up. You think it's going to be like a nice break, but long, steep descents, in my opinion, are almost harder than going up. They're just so brutal on the joints and the muscles of your legs that it takes such a beating. And that descent into town in particular was was pretty brutal, but we made it in and we ended up spending a couple hours in town. Day 3 was probably our hottest day, and so we waited a bit of the heat out in town. We also needed to charge our phones and our battery packs, so we like sat at this burger joint, ate some food, and then we moved to a coffee shop and plugged in and drank some really nice coffee as well there. So had a pretty lazy sort of midday into the early afternoon, and then had another massive climb out of Courmayeur and took another high route alternate that afternoon as well, climbing climbing all the way up to well over 2,500 meters above sea level. I can't remember the name of the mountain, but I remember just that ascent took us all afternoon, and we didn't get to like our camping spot until like 7 8 p.m. or something. Luckily, the sun wasn't setting till like 9:30, but that was a long day, and we only walked 27 kilometers, but it was just a lot of up and a lot of down, well over 2,000 meters of both. And so we were sore. And I remember we got to 2,500 meters, the high point of the day towards the end, and this thunderstorm was rolling in, and we were like at the most exposed point of this ridge, and there was like lightning and thunder just over the other side of the valley. So we like hustled down off the mountain. Emma like slipped over on the way down, and we got a bit lower before we set up camp. And we were a bit worried that night about lightning and rain, but ended up kind of dodging most of the bad weather. It was funny though, that night, a bunch of cows came up to our tents at like midnight or 1 a.m. or something. I can't even remember what time, but I remember waking up to like this sniffing right next to my head outside of my tent, and I was so confused at what it was. And Emma was like talking to me from her tent, which was like 10 meters away, like freaking out, like what's going on? And I was freaking out as well. Ended up opening up my tent, and there was like 5 huge black cows just chilling right next to our tents. And I was so scared that they were just going to like trample over us. So I ended up jumping out of the tent and like chasing them off. But there's so many cows and sheep along the trail because it's just like grazing for them, and I guess a lot of the land is privately owned for agriculture, and so did see a lot of cows and sheep specifically out there. And yeah, at the end of day 3, we a nice close encounter with some of them. They didn't cause us any harm, but they got a bit too close for comfort, that's for sure. Day 4 we crossed into Switzerland, so country number 3 on the TMB. 4 days, 3 countries already, and we crossed over Grand Col Ferret to get into Switzerland. And I remember that climb up to the col being probably the hardest climb for me on the trip. I think I just was really fatigued by day 4. We got up early, we made the descent from camp. We passed by this refuge where we stopped for breakfast. We made our own breakfast there, and it was just, I remember that morning being so beautiful. The views and the light were just magic. But then we started this climb up to Grand Col Ferret, and it was so slow and hard. Actually, that climb was really busy. There was a lot of day hikers because there was like a car park at the bottom of the valley, and that was probably part of the reason it was really hard, because I kept having to pass people just constantly, and some hikers just are so ignorant of the fact that people are stuck behind them and they won't step to the side or whatever, and it's so hard when you don't speak the language to ask nicely to get past, and that was probably a bit frustrating. But eventually we made it up to the top of that pass and then descended into Switzerland. And a good chunk of day 4 actually was, I think about 20-kilometer stretch was like a gradual descent, which was really easy on the legs and a nice little break. And we passed through a couple of Swiss towns, La Folie and Ferret, and we got a we got a real taste of Switzerland prices. Switzerland's obviously pretty notorious for being very expensive, and we found out how true that was on day 4 of the TMB. I think we stopped at a cafe in one of the towns, and we paid €5 for a relatively small glass of Coca-Cola, which is like 10 Australian dollars, which blew my mind. And then because you can't wild camp in Switzerland, we ended up pushing on for a pretty big day to a third town called Champellat. And yeah, it was like, what was it, like almost €30 to set up a tent on a patch of grass in that town at the local campground. So probably the most I've ever paid to camp in my life. But yeah, that's just Switzerland for you. That town was really beautiful though. But it was a big day 4. We pushed 43 kilometers, so it was our longest day, almost 2,000 meters up and well over 2,000 meters down. But we just kind of had to push to one of these towns to be able to camp legally, and we didn't want to wild camp, even though we definitely saw people wild camping along the trail who didn't want to pay those prices and just wanted to set up. But yeah, we pushed to town. We set up camp amongst a lot of other hikers. And I mean, to be fair, the campsite was quite nice. You had a nice grassed area. You had, a kitchen area. You had nice bathrooms and showers and laundry and all that stuff included. But we paid €30 almost to set up a camp each person. So that's like €90 between the three of us, or something ridiculously close to that. So that was a bit of a shock to the system. But yeah, made it to the end of day 4, huge day. And the next morning, we started the day with a side route, or another alternate route, sorry. And this one was notorious for being the hardest alternate on the TMB, up to Fenêtre de Pet, which is another high pass. But this alternate route was like particularly technical. Like, we were on the way up, we were just boulder hopping and scrambling through this valley as we ascended up to the pass, and it was just nothing like the rest of the TMB, which is pretty like manicured trail, that people are constantly walking on. But this alternate route definitely wasn't super popular. We only saw a handful of other hikers on it, and it took us forever to ascend up to the pass. And the pass, I haven't got it written down here, but it was very high. I think it was 2,800 meters maybe above sea level, the pass. I believe it was the highest point on the TMB for us. And the alternate, I think, actually is technically like a couple kilometers shorter than the classic route, but no doubt it was a lot harder. But it was well worth it. Even though we had some fairly poor weather that day and the high pass was clouded out, on the ascent it was just stunning, and there was like wild berries everywhere and just incredible, really rugged mountain views. And then on the descent from the high pass on the other side, there was like glaciers and waterfalls everywhere. It was so beautiful. And we met this guy Benny, I think he was German, up at the pass, and ended up hiking with Benny for a good chunk of that day. He was really cool. And on the way down from the pass as well, we like stumbled across this like rock cabin next to the trail, and it just looked abandoned and old. But there was this guy who popped his head out of the cabin. His name was Pascal. He was this Swiss dude or French dude, I can't remember, but no, he was French. Well, at least he spoke French, because we couldn't communicate with him at all. Benny, who we were with, spoke a little bit of French, but this guy Pascal popped his head out of his little cabin in the middle of nowhere and just said, come in, come in. And he had a fire going, and there was barely enough room for all of us to stand in there. It was tiny, but he made us like tea, and we had broken conversation with him. And it was just such a random, but one of those really memorable moments on a trail like this, where we just had tea with a stranger, with a local who lived out in the mountains. And, we didn't have deep conversation or anything with him, but, we shared something special. It was really cool. Yeah, we ended up descending after leaving Pascal's cabin into the town of Trient, which had a massive campsite that a lot of people were camping at, because we were still in Switzerland, so you kind of had to. But we decided to just push on even further on our 5th day, and we made another big climb back into France and ended up wild camping at just the most incredible spot. I guess it doesn't really have a name. I can't really explain to you where it was, but it was just after crossing back into France, going counterclockwise on the TMB, which I should have mentioned. We went counterclockwise, and it was just such a magical spot. And yeah, very, very good day once again on the TMB. We only walked about 24 kilometers, but it was a slow day just because of how technical and how much vertical gain and loss there was. And then day 6, which was our last day, we had another big push to finish on day 6, but we were pretty keen to get it done. We originally planned to walk it in 7 days, but I think ended up pushing just a little bit and doing it in 6. The annoying part of day 6 was that I lost my poles pretty early on in the day. I remember we were walking along this ridge in the morning. It was so beautiful. In fact, that might have been the most beautiful section of the trail of the whole trip. Just stunning light in the clouds. There was low clouds, and Mont Blanc looked amazing. And I remember stopping to get my camera out to take some photos, and I spent a bit of time getting some product shots for my company OptiVenture. And I put my poles down, and I must have just like finished the photo shoot and kept walking, and I left my poles behind, and then I descended off the ridge and I didn't realize I didn't have my poles until I got to the bottom, which was just so silly. So I dropped my pack. I ran back up the mountain like 3 kilometers, and my poles were gone. So someone had obviously nabbed them. Well, I don't want to say someone stole them necessarily. They might have picked them up hoping to return them, but I didn't see the people that got them. So I lost my poles. And I was carrying a trekking pole tent on this trip. So I desperately need poles to be able to camp. Luckily, this was our last day. And so not having them wasn't like super detrimental, but it ended up being such a hard final day that I really wish I had the poles just to help me hike. But after I lost them, we had a big climb, a very long climb up to Le Brevent, which is about 2,500 meters, a big mountain that has like a refuge and a chairlift to the top of it. It was really cool. And on the way up, it was a lot of fun. There was like a sort of a via ferrata section, nothing you had to have a harness and rope for or like tie yourself onto it, but there was like ladders and metal steps, and it was just vertical climbing, super fun. We eventually made it up to Le Brevent. The weather was shocking up the top, fully clouded out, but had a few sort of peaks through the clouds at the Mont Blanc range, and man, it was so beautiful. But not gonna lie, we were so exhausted by the time we got up to the top of that climb, and all that was left to do that day was descend back to Les Herchers. But it was like another 1,500 meter descent, and I had no poles, and man, I was so cooked. It was a pretty intense 6 days, and yeah, we eventually made it back to town though. Ended up doing 40 kilometers with 2,300 meters of gain, and it was over 3,000 meters of descent. So just a massive day of elevation change. Didn't help that I did an extra 5 or 6 kilometers and a few hundred meters of vert to go looking for my poles, but regardless, was a freaking massive day. Made it back to Les Riches, and then we caught a Uber into Chamonix where we spent the night and had a big feed and celebrated finishing the trail. It was just, yeah, it was an incredible 6 days. One of the most beautiful hikes I've ever done, for sure. The main downside being that it was quite busy, in a lot of sections, especially parts where there was a lot of day hikers. And yeah, overall, just a magical hike. All right, I'm going to get into some of the audience questions. Thanks for sending in your questions. Really appreciate it, guys. And lots of you were very curious about the TMB. It's obviously a very big bucket list hike for a lot of people. And so happy to answer some of the questions. First up, do you need a permit? How about the wild camping? Do you need to book it, and is it allowed? So there's no permits for the TMB. You just show up and hike it. And as far as the wild camping, I've touched a bit on it before. There's obviously different regulations for each country, but yeah, it is allowed in certain places. So as long as you follow the regulations, it's doable. Besides, a few sections like in Switzerland where you've got to pay for camping. But yeah, we didn't really plan ahead or book anything. We just showed up, relatively last minute. We decided to walk the trail and just camped the whole way and didn't have any issues at all. Next question, is there any way you could do a cost breakdown? Yeah, for sure. I really didn't spend much money. I would say I tried to have a little think about this before the podcast. Somewhere between 20 and 40 euros I spent each day, I would say. And 90% of that was just on food. So I was eating pretty cheaply from supermarkets, but the prices were pretty expensive, in these small mountain towns, especially in Switzerland. But I'd be eating like baguettes and cheese and salami for most of my meals. And then just typical trail snacks that I picked up from the supermarket as well. I think we ate out a few times, like we got burgers in one town and drinks in a few refuges and stuff like that. So I reckon on average, probably, yeah, between 20 and 30 euro a day, like really not much. Like all the camping accommodation was free besides that one campsite in Switzerland. And so it was very, very affordable. If you decided though to stay in refuges every night and eat out for most of your meals, it's going to be a lot more expensive. Like some of those refuges were like €100 for the night. And yeah, you get dinner and breakfast typically, and you get a bed and a shower and all that kind of stuff. So it makes the hike a lot easier and you have a lot less weight in your pack. It's going to be pretty expensive. Like you can easily probably spend €1,000+ on a TMB loop, whereas we would have only spent a couple €100. I think I don't have the exact numbers, but really was not expensive at all for us overall. Someone asks, the views look stunning, but is it worth it considering the crowds? That's a good question. Yeah, for me, I hate hiking in crowds, so it's definitely a trade off. I would say it's 100% worth it still. It is just such a great trail, so incredibly beautiful. It's probably not a trail that I'd ever do again, to be honest, because of the crowds. There are a lot of trails that I've done that I love that I would do 100 more times. And I think that's probably the difference for me on the TMB is I have not a huge amount of interest in re-walking the trail just because of how many people are out there. It's not the same wilderness experience that I prefer. So in that way, yeah, I probably wouldn't repeat it, but I would say that it's a hike that any big time hiker, anyone who's really into the outdoors and trails should do. It's just really special. Someone else asked, do you prefer the rugged woodness of hiking on a trail like the PCT or the more developed hiking on the TMB? And so that I guess that kind of continues on from the last question. I definitely prefer the more wilderness hiking on a trail like the PCT. Like the PCT was a 5 month hike, but I would hike that trail 100 more times. It's just, I was talking a lot about this with Dan and Emma on the trail, comparing the Sierra Nevada range in California that we walked through on the PCT compared to the European Alps. And all three of us, I think, preferred the Sierra Nevada by quite a margin. And, it's equally as beautiful, both ranges, but the wildness of the Sierra is just so magical. Like you don't see a road for weeks, you don't see buildings, you don't see many people. Whereas in the Alps, there's just refuges everywhere. There's agriculture, there's towns everywhere, there's chairlifts and ski lifts, there's power lines going, through sections of the trail in the middle of the Alps. It's not the same at all, and I much prefer the wildness of something like the Sierra Nevada. So it's a different hike, and the TMB is not probably the type of trail that I would usually choose, but it was an incredible experience regardless. Someone else asks, is there any wild animals there on the TMB trek? Yeah, there was quite a bit of wildlife. That's honestly another big reason that I prefer like the PCT because the amount of wildlife was just immense because of how wild it is. We saw bears and deers and elk and squirrels and marmots and pikers, so much wildlife. Whereas on the TMB, while there is wildlife, it's such a busy trail that's been de-wilded almost due to tourism and all this kind of stuff that you don't really see that much. But we did see, chamois. I think we saw some elk. We saw marmots. Obviously saw lots of cows and sheep. So we saw animals out there and quite a bit of wildlife as well. But it's probably not a trail that you go hike to see wildlife. There's plenty of better options out there for sure. How is the elevation compared to the Camino? Yeah, it's such a stark contrast walking across Spain on the Camino de Santiago for a month prior to walking the TMB because the Camino is just dead flat. This is, I'm assuming the person asking this question is asking it in a joking way. I think total on the Camino, in 33 days of walking, we probably did, 5, 6, 7,000 meters of elevation gain. So relatively nothing. Whereas on the TMB, we did like 12,000 in 6 days. So just a world of difference, and I much prefer the mountains. But the Camino wasn't so much a hike as it was, well, a pilgrimage. Obviously, that's more of a cultural, spiritual, social journey, whereas the TMB is more that mountain and rugged sort of adventure. So very different. What would your suggestion be for getting into shape for this hike? Good question. I guess it's just the same as any hike. You want to be getting your steps in back home, walking as much as possible. Just getting time on feet is really key to get your tendons and your ligaments and your muscles and your joints all ready for the demands of spending a lot of time upright and moving on a trail like the TMB. I think particularly on a mountain trail like this where there's going to be a lot of climbing and descending, you want to practice that for sure. So getting on the Stairmaster at the gym or getting out to your local trails where there's some steep hills you can climb up and down is going to be really useful. And as with any hike, you want to prepare with your gear as well. You want to test your gear, of course, whether it's your tent or just your backpack, depending what you're planning to do on the trail. but walk with it, use it, and put some weight in your pack to sort of simulate the real demands of a trail. And just do as much of that as possible before heading out, and you should be good. Really, I just tell people just to get 10, 15,000 steps in per day as a minimum, trying to get as many of those steps in on similar terrain to the hike you're trying to plan for, and as many of those steps in with the gear that you're going to be using on the hike. And that's just going to prepare your body as well for the specific demands of the adventure. All right, last question. What is the fastest time the TMB can be done in? Well, as I mentioned, we walked the trail in 6 days, which is well above the average time it takes people. Typically 10 to 12 days is probably the more relaxed way to do the TMB, going from refuge to refuge or from campsite to campsite. 6 days is already pretty fast. We met a couple people on the trail that were doing it in 5 days, I believe. And I actually remember seeing or talking to someone on Instagram who was doing it in like 4.5 days. So you can hike the trail in probably like maybe 4 or 5 days if you absolutely sent it. I feel like we sent it pretty hard, and we did it in 6 days. So that's already pretty fast. But I mean, technically, like, the Ultra Trail du Mont Blanc happens every year, and the winning times are sub 24 hours, and they're pretty much, as far as I know, following the TMB route. So I think the fastest time ever is like 19 hours on the TMB, which is a ridiculous time, but that's obviously not hiking with the pack. That's running, and that's literally the most elite ultra runners in the world. So just a different world, and not a world that I'm living in, as much as I enjoy watching those guys go that fast. But I guess, people say that about how I hike. I got plenty of messages on my TMB content on Instagram saying I was going too fast. So it's all relative, but just go as fast or as slow as you enjoy. And yeah, don't rush it if you don't want to, but it's always nice to challenge yourself and, push yourself in the outdoors. It's such a great place for growth as well. So that's up to you. All right, that is all the questions, and I think that's all I have to say. End up going, what are we doing? Almost 45 minutes. So fairly long episode of Trail Talk, but a trail like this definitely warrants it. Hope you guys enjoyed listening to the TMB recap. Hope you found it interesting. If you have any more questions, feel free to comment on the podcast or send me a DM on Instagram. Happy to help you guys get out into the wild, onto the trails as much as possible. That's why I do this, so feel free to reach out. If you did enjoy the episode, please make sure to rate the podcast as well. Rate us 5 stars wherever you're listening. Follow the show as well. Subscribe if you're listening on YouTube. Do all of that good stuff. It really helps the show grow, and really appreciate all the support, and so glad that you guys are here listening and enjoying, and getting around the outdoors, because it's just the best thing in the world. All right, guys, I will see you in next week's episode. Have a good week. Catch you soon. Peace.